All righty, shall we dive in? I know we'll have some folks who will join in and we'll get them all caught up as they do. Also, we are recording today, so folks will be able to review this, share this out with your boards, with your other market staff and volunteers, really get the word out. Before I jump in, Amanda, do you have any announcements that need to go out?
Thanks, Shiny. No, you can just head right into it.
All righty. So we'll get started. Today, we're going to talk about making progress toward anti-racist farmers markets. I say making progress toward because anti-racism is not a final destination. It's not a place we wake up one day and say, ah, I have arrived. So it's a continual progression toward this destination. So my name is Shiny, and first and foremost, I'm a farmer. I am also a farmer's market manager, so I am one of us, as they say. I'm Black, surprise. I'm queer, I'm a woman. I come from Oakland, California, as I like to say up here, the Forbidden State. My Oakland is a city that is shaped radically by harmful and oppressive systems. My Oakland is the city of a government-funded crack epidemic. I also have some privilege. I found it really easy to access education in my life and to move through white dominant spaces. I move and speak in a way that has a lot of palatability to whiteness. As a part of that, I was a librarian and a college professor for 13 years, and I place really high value on research and the written word. These are things I know about myself. I've also been a community organizer for 21, 22 years now. So I've been talking to people about community needs, doing assessment and analysis of what's happening in community spaces, and helping folks organize to make change for a really, really long time. I've got some objectives and guidelines for us today, so I want to share those with you, and wherever possible, just make transparent the assumptions that I'm making. So the point of today's workshop, whether you're watching it live now with me or you're catching this later in a video, is for you to feel empowered to take action against white supremacy, right? Like at the heart of anti-racist business is action. So I really, really want you to feel like you're able to take your first steps or your next steps on your path of action against white supremacy. The objective for today is not for you to feel guilt or shame. Guilt and shame don't move the needle on white supremacy and white supremacy culture. Guilt and shame are not at the foundation of anti-racist action. Sometimes they can inspire useful reflection and thought about ourselves and how we move through the world, but they really don't become a part of anti-racist action. So I don't want you to feel guilt and shame today. I do want you to know that it's okay to feel uncomfortable, right? Like racism, white supremacy, these are stark and harmful forms of oppression, and they come with a significant amount of discomfort. So it's okay to feel uncomfortable, to be present with that. And I do want you to try to stay present. Anti-racist action really stems in large part from being present, from being able to say, this is what's happening right now, and this needs to be interrupted. I have some guidelines about how we're going to hold all this discomfort today and move things forward with anti-racist action. I do want you to use the chat. It is not disrespectful to me. It's not distracting to me. It is not doing something wrong or bad. It is making connection. And making connection is how we co-construct understanding. And while I have a lot of lived experience that speaks to anti-racist action and deconstructing white supremacy, I'm not an expert. There's no one who's an expert at this. So we're going to co-construct a lot of understanding together. I want to build on some structures that Peter established in their previous workshop on uprooting white supremacy. If you weren't there, that's totally okay. I'm going to explain it all along the way. But if you were there or you watched the video, you'll see some things that are familiar. So we're going to use the concept of stack or taking stack to indicate that you want to unmute. And so in chat, you will just type stack, ideally in all caps because it's easier to see. And either I'll see that and ask you to unmute and to go ahead and share, or Rose, who's here helping us hold down technology and chat and all of those things, will interrupt me and let me know that there's folks who really want to speak their own thoughts and ideas into the space. Sometimes a tiny box with little squiggles is insufficient, and we totally get that. So you'll type stack when you want to unmute, and we'll add you to the stack of people who want to share some content. I want you to push yourself to ask questions that are questions. And what I mean by asking questions that are questions is often when we raise our hand or we say stack or we start typing, we really want to tell a story, right? I love to tell stories. Story is beautiful. Story is very human instinct, but story is not necessarily a question. I also want you to be mindful of opinions that are masquerading as questions, right? So like, just because you stick a question mark on the end doesn't actually mean that you are expressing a question. So let's really work at honing that ability to ask questions that are questions. And I say this as a person who wants to tell a story and have an opinion on everything, and where I'm often having to ask myself to move up into that place of just hold that opinion and listen. I want you to be kind to one another, not just today, but all the days. Moving forward, when we interact on the OFMA listserv, I want us to be kind to one another. When we interact on social media or we come slinking through one another's markets and say hi, I want us to be kind to one another. And I want to be clear that kindness is not the same thing as being nice, right? Like these are really different things. A person can see you bumpity bump your way into the grocery store parking lot with a flat tire and come up and help you start changing that tire. And they can do it all the while being like, what an idiot, who gets a flat tire out here? What are you doing today, right? Like that's not very nice, but it was really kind. They did actually help you address the problem. So nice is a thing that you get to mediate and decide on your own. And we have our own ways of being nice, and we have our own geographies of nice, right? We have all of the stereotypes about what kinds of people are nice in the Pacific Northwest, who's nice in New York City. They probably don't look the same. What it means to be kind, fundamentally at its core, is the same thing, right? And being kind is about compassion. So I also want you to seek compassionate curiosity. And we'll talk a lot about what compassionate curiosity means, but start asking more questions. Try to figure out what's happening with this person. Where are they coming from? Why are they behaving this way? How can I get closer to understanding what's going on with them? Who hurt you, boo? You know, all of those kinds of things are about seeking compassionate curiosity, which helps us to be kind to one another and helps us to move beyond stereotypes and helps us to move beyond all kinds of things. I also want you to avoid whataboutism. Whataboutism is a really good indication that you're actually not being present, right? Because whatabouts are things out in the world that we can imagine or speculate could happen. And whataboutism is frequently a derailing tactic, right? Like this is how, when something is uncomfortable, rather than just sitting with the discomfort, we usually can find a way to say, oh, well, but what about this mythical situation where this could happen and that would no longer apply? There are always whatabouts out there, but if we're being present with each other and with ourselves and with our intentions and with our compassionate curiosity, we can put the whatabouts aside and know that we'll address them at another time. So as much as possible, stay present. Try not to feel guilt or shame because they're not the point. Guilt and shame is a very individual response. And when we're feeling guilt and shame, we're usually making things about us that aren't necessarily about us. Do chat. Use stack to unmute, ask lots of questions, and let's be really conversational. As much as possible, I would love to talk with you and not at you. So that's how we're going where we're going today. The places that we're going to, we're going to talk about positionality. We're going to define some terms and unpack some more assumptions. We're going to talk about white supremacy culture and what's going on with white supremacy culture. I promise to leave you with at least 5 things that you can actually get out into the world and start doing in terms of taking anti-racist action. And I wanted to have more time to talk with one another. And we can do that conversationally throughout the whole thing. We can hold it for the end and have some big conversations. We can do both of those things. It's all about how the flow works for us today. Speaking of flow, I'll also mention that I have two really rascally dogs, and I have actually sedated them and parked them out in the sun in the backyard today in hopes that they can just chill and get it together. They also like to troll my neighbors at the fence line a lot. So I may have a moment where I'm like, wow, these dogs are really losing it. And I'm going to go open the door and tell them to knock that off, and we'll just keep it moving and it's all going to be okay. You also may have things going on where you're like, oh, I have to drop out. I'll catch the rest on video. I'm not going to take personal affront at that. Or I'm not feeling well, or I have another meeting, or I just need to get up and get some water, or I really need to breathe and move around and stretch because this is uncomfortable content and I'm staring at a small screen. All of those things are very okay. If it helps you to relax, know that I'm sharing a screen and I actually can't see most of your little postage stamps, which is a bummer to me. I really actually wish that I could be seeing you and connecting with you a little bit more in that way. That's what we've got going on with technology. So I gave you an introduction to me, and it was a particular kind of introduction. And some of you might have been thinking, this is the weirdest start to a workshop ever. Like, who's telling me these kinds of things? Why are you telling me these things? And what I gave you by way of an introduction is something that we call a positionality statement. And a positionality statement is actually a tool that I'm borrowing from social science researchers, which are some of my background homies. And positionality statements are a way to help people situate and contextualize who you are. It's a way of explaining to people the lenses that you are filtering the world through. Understanding someone's positionality helps us establish meaningful connections. It helps us express that compassionate curiosity. It also helps us hold ourselves accountable for our biases. So positionality is about helping people see, often with story and narrative, the sort of social and political context for your identity. And those can involve all of those social statuses and categories. That's your race, class, gender, sexuality, orientation, ability, status. I would add in there place of nationality. It could involve our immigration status or citizenship status. There's lots of places that positionality comes up. So it has one, the goal of helping us explain ourselves to other people in a more nuanced fashion. It also helps people see how your identity really shapes and sometimes biases your interactions in the world, right? So I told you some things that you could see about me pretty clearly, right? I am Black. I am a woman. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's my gender, but you can see that at some point, you know, I'm expressing in a particular way. I also told you things that you can't see about me, but you might have heard about me or read about me somewhere. Like, I'm queer. I'm pretty open about that. I'm a farmer. Lots of you know that about me. Lots of you know that I'm a farmer's market manager, or you've heard of the come through market or something related there. I also told you not just where I'm from, but the social and political context of where I come from. In 2021, Oakland has one kind of reputation. It's very multicultural. It's like Portland of the Bay Area in lots of ways, but that's not my Oakland. That's not where I grew up. And I gave you the political context for my Oakland, right? Which is about a crack epidemic funded by the government. It's about really harmful and oppressive systems. And those are also things that still show up in the reputation of that place. But that's how I understand the place that I'm from. And that's important to get. I also told you some things about my employment background, right? So I've been in higher ed for a really long time, and I privilege certain types of communication. I am very aware that I can easily be swayed by research and the written word. And we'll talk a little bit about how those things show up in white supremacy culture. But the idea is that there's more than just my name, my gender and pronouns, and where I live now and where I used to live. There is the situational context of those pieces of identity. I also told you that I've been a community organizer for over 20 years, but I didn't expressly get into the communities that I've been organizing in. But it tells you maybe a little bit about the way that I approach community and that I believe that there's change to be made in the world. So that was my positionality statement. A positionality statement could be really long, it could be really short. Of course, we're customizing it for the group that we're talking to. What happens when we start to understand the context of people is that we're able to connect to that compassion a little bit more easily. We're able to get curious about, oh, what does this mean? I don't know what you meant when you said that. I'm not sure what you were indicating to me by sharing this thing. And it gives us more fertile ground for finding nuance with one another. So I would love for you all to do a little activity for just a couple of minutes. I want to take a few minutes where you're thinking about your positionality. How do your lenses filter your understanding of the world? How are you moving through the world relative to your identity? And then I want you to drop in chat just a little snippet of a personality statement for you. You might include something about where you grew up, where your people are from historically. It might include information about your ethnic or your class background. It could include lots of other things. But we want to give each other the chance to find a little nuance, find a little curiosity about one another, and also sit down in the vulnerability of sharing, because that can be a really strong feeling for folks. So take a couple minutes, and if you feel moved to share, please do. If you are just not in that space today, that's totally okay. I would love it if you would make these notes for yourself. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Tammy. Nice, thanks, Sage. I spent about a decade living in Santa Cruz County. A lot of my community organizing context originates from there. Yeah, thanks, Rose. Your statement helps me to remember that what we see about people who live in RVs on Instagram isn't necessarily everybody's reality, you know, that hashtag van living or whatever it is. doesn't tell everything about where people come from, and certainly not everybody having that small scale life is doing it because they're on a grand adventure. I think because we're friends, I know that you're on a grand adventure, but that there's so much more contextualizing all of that, right? And yeah, like Anna is sharing, there's where we were raised, and then there's where our heart comes from, there's where our identity comes from, and those aren't necessarily the houses where we first, tripped over something and got a skinned knee. Those aren't necessarily the places that we first went to school. And for folks who can be really connected to some places in their identity, sometimes that is about the places where it started to gel, where it started to really, form in a way that was identifiable to ourselves. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Sometimes our home place is not the place we left. Sometimes home is the place we end up. Sometimes home is lots of places we've been. Sometimes home is where the job is, and then it moves again, and home is somewhere else. Oh, yeah. Nonprofit professionals as an identity. I super relate to that, Darcy. Yeah, it gets in there and it's insidious. Sometimes it's really great, and sometimes you're like, how did this become such a core piece of who I am and what I do? I super relate to that. Yeah. So how was that for everyone? How was it to share in this type of way that we don't go around sharing all the time? I'm betting it was vulnerable. I'm betting it was awkward. I see some nodding. I'm cheating and I'm not looking at my slide. I'm just looking at you all. It's great. Yeah, I noticed that a lot of you named things that white folks often don't name. When we ask white people about their identities and where they come from, one of the things they never say is that they're white. And I noticed that a lot of you have really acknowledged that, yeah, Darcy, it's a little scary to share, for sure. Thank you for being bold and brave today. And so I wonder if it's that lots of us thought to share about our ethnic background because it was in the prompt. I wonder if lots of us thought to, yeah, thank you, Tammy, for getting out there first. I wonder if lots of us thought about it because we're in an anti-racist workshop. It's top of mind right now. But very often when you ask white folks to talk about where their identity is at, where they're really from, one of the things they never ever say is, oh, and I'm white. And we know the reasons for that. The reasons for that are because whiteness is the default in our society. You don't have to tell anyone you're white. White is the default. White is considered normal, right? And so very often people don't say those things. And depending on the communities that we move in, I relate to that, Melissa. Often the part that's really scary for me to share is that I'm Black, even though people can see these things, right? But just naming that thing and saying it gives it a different kind of weight, a different specific gravity. And yeah, I absolutely relate to that. And so one of the things that getting practice at this does is help us start to see all of the things that are not necessarily normal or default, or all of the ways that our social structures have established things as normal or default. We often find when we engage with other people about the nuances of their identity or their positionality, that we have things in common that we didn't necessarily think we were going to have in common, right? We've got some nonprofit threads running here that I'm sure more than one or two of us can connect to in some ways. We've got a lot of experiences of displacement, either because of circumstance, like there weren't any jobs and I had to move, or experiences of just moving a bunch and really being able to connect about being new in a place, right? So we've got a lot of ways that we can understand one another differently, with more texture, with more detail. And also the act of being vulnerable is good practice. Vulnerability is like a muscle, and you do get muscle memory for it. You do get easier at being vulnerable the more that you do it. And why that's important is because anti-racist work is incredibly vulnerable. Interrupting oppressive behavior is vulnerable feeling, right? What if that person calls you a jerk? What if that person calls you something much more intense than a jerk? And learning to really sit with and hold that discomfort is one of the key skills, is one of the big aptitudes that really helps us get where we're going. So I'm going to continue to ask you all to practice some vulnerability today as we go. I think you'll also find that learning about positionality helps you just get more and more curious, right? Because you already start thinking, I wonder these things about people I work with every day. I don't know these things about those people. I wonder about my volunteers. Where are they really from? How is their identity constructed? What are the intersections in there? What are the things that I can't see about them? What are the things I can't see about them, but I keep acting as though I can? What are the things I've made up about people in my own head? And one thing I think it's sometimes helpful to know is that there's not just one style of curiosity. So sort of clinically, we understand there to be several types of curiosity. And I know this because this is my research background in academia, is understanding the types of curiosity that people have. So some folks have interpersonal curiosity. Our curiosity drive is made up of wanting to understand the nuances of people's lives and stories. If you're the kind of person who visits other people's houses, pre-pandemic living, and you look in medicine cabinets, hi, it's me, you probably have a high degree of interpersonal curiosity. What is in your refrigerator? Why do you drink blueberry pomegranate acai yogurt in the morning? What is the glop in the mason jar? That's me. That's interpersonal curiosity. We also can have lots of perceptual curiosity, right? Perceptual curious people are in yarn stores rubbing things on their faces, right? Like, oh, how do I perceive this? We're sniffing stuff everywhere. At my grocery store, before I was a farmer, one of the grocers is the kind of person who sniffs everybody's produce. And she knows that about herself, and she'll name it like, sorry, I'm just deeply curious about how everything in the world smells. And it's really weird to have somebody like huffing your cilantro before it goes in the bag, but that's a part of the curiosity. There are people who are epistemologically curious, meaning they want to know how everything works. How does this thing put together? How does it come back apart again? How can I understand how stuff works all the time? And that stuff can be complex theoretical things. It could be math. It could be the people who want to take apart every toaster that didn't work exactly the way you thought it would. And nobody has just one of these styles of curiosity. So I say this to you just to help you connect with the curiosity, that it could have been your experience, let's say in grade school, that you had a crummy third grade teacher who wrote on your report card that you weren't very curious. And really what they meant was, my weird prompts for creative storytelling didn't inspire this kid, right? It doesn't mean that you don't have curiosity. It might mean that the person who said that really privileges one style of curiosity, and that's not the one that speaks the most to you. I do not want to eat weird foods, ever. I'm like a fifth grader from 1955, and I would be happy to eat tacos every Tuesday and meatloaf every Monday and spaghetti on Thursday every single week without fail. I'd be delighted. All of my friends in Portland here have these kids that are really radically cultured and want to eat spicy, like Sichuan food at 6 and 5 years old, and want to eat weird, to me, weird vegetables and all kinds of things. And I'm like, wow, I'm never going to be like your kid. I don't have that kind of curiosity. It doesn't move me. So the more we can understand about ourselves and our curiosity, the more we can have these more nuanced interactions with people. The more nuanced our interactions with people, the closer we're getting towards some form of anti-racist activity. So let's unpack some definitions, explain my assumptions about a few things, and really just get clear about what we're talking about today. Race and racism. These are experiences and systems that we work within every day, that we live within. So first, I need you to know that race is a made-up thing. Absolutely made up. Saying made up is just an easier and more accessible way of saying that race is a socially constructed theory. Socially constructed. It's not biologically determined. There is nothing whatsoever that is scientific about race. If you didn't know that, now you do. It's a thing you can really easily Google. You're going to hear me tell you to GTS very often today, or Google that stuff. So if you didn't know this, now you do. Race is made up in not just one way, not just two ways, but multiple ways. Much of the language we use every day is the language of made up race. And even I trip over things every day where I'm like, oh, right, that's a made up part of race. Humans are very fond of making up constructs. So race is not the only made up construct we live under. Gender is a made up construct in lots of ways. Money is a made up construct. Time, in the way that we live it with a clock, is absolutely a made up construct. So people make things up all the time and then cement them in place and allow them to govern. So we have to start by acknowledging that race is made up. There is nothing scientifically different. I find this really weird. There's nothing scientifically, genetically different than Africans and Europeans. We have pretty much the same genetic material going on. So race is a made up thing. Racism, on the other hand, is an everyday experience. This is not an exceptional thing. This is not the thing that happens out there in those places with those people. Racism happens every single day. And I think that the way that we understand it is such that we want to believe that racism is maybe an everyday experience for people of color, right? And it is, certainly. Racism is an everyday experience for people of color. But I think it's important to underscore that racism is also an everyday experience for white people. And when I say that, I'm not saying because all white people are racists. What I'm saying is racism as an experience is the water in our fishbowl. White supremacy and white supremacy culture are the water we are swimming in every day. It's what we breathe. It's what we're surrounded by. It touches us in so many ways every single day. And that means it touches white people in those ways every single day. And I think it's important to unpack that because we get on the surface very easily that experiencing racism is a traumatic experience, right? Like, this is not good for people. This is not helping people live their best, most whole, most plugged in selves. So racism is an everyday experience, and it gets on me and it gets on you. It gets on everybody, and it harms everybody who touches it. It also benefits some people, right? Both and. Multiple things can be true at one time. Racism is harmful to everyone it touches, which is everyone. And it also benefits white folks of all classes and all class backgrounds. And I think that it can be very easy to want to disaggregate along class lines and to say, well, but okay, but really in this country, for people of particular class backgrounds or experiencing particular class statuses in this country, this is really the same type of thing. And it's not. Racism benefits white folks of all classes, full stop. Having said that, I will acknowledge and point out that race and class and gender and orientation and ability and nationality and immigration status and all of those social statuses and structures, they do create overlapping, interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage, right? This stuff is bad for everybody, and it's bad for everybody in complex and intersectional ways. If intersectionality is true, because it is, and it must be true, it's also true, particularly in this country, that race must be at the center of any equity and inclusion policy or action. It has to be there because of the context of this country. Now, I really, really, really do want to be clear that you did not hear me say that race was the most important form of discrimination and disadvantage. Like, it's so important to me that you get this, that I want you to say it out loud to yourself right now. Shiny did not say that race was the most important form of discrimination. Yeah, I see you doing it. Thank you. It is important, right? Like, that is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the way that this country was built is such that race is the longest standing social issue, the longest standing form of oppression we've had to deal with in this country. And it will be the longest standing form of oppression. And if this is the thing, if this is so foundational, then we have to put it at the heart of our analysis. We have to put it at the heart of our policies and our planning. We have to be unpacking it intentionally all the time. And we'll do that in an intersectional way, right? Because we know that class is racialized. We know that it's cruddier to be Black and to have less access to economic means. We know that it's really, really extra cruddy in this country. And by cruddy, I mean harmful, deadly, oppressive, traumatic, dangerous to be a Black trans woman in this country, right? So all of these intersectional places are also very racialized. And it's not that race is the most important, but it informs and shapes everything that happens in this country. And if all of those things are true, which they are, then it also stands to reason that anti-racism is good for everybody. And that's a thing that if you're really getting serious about anti-racist action in your markets, in your communities, you're gonna find yourself saying over and over and over again, because you're gonna have people whose intersections for themselves don't focus on and revolve around race. And they're gonna say, this is you not caring about my people, about my positionality, about the place that I arrive in this conversation and community. And you're just going to learn to keep saying, I hear you, and anti-racism is good for everybody. So I want to just keep saying that thing over and over again. This is about systems, right? It's very, very easy to get distracted into talking about individuals. But what we're talking about here is systems. And this is something that Peter underscored over and over again in their Uprooting White Supremacy talk. And in fact, this is their language. White supremacy is a system. It is the system that enables the experience of racism. So racism is an experience that happens within the white supremacist system. When white supremacy is present, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are white supremacists present. And I think that that's an important thing for us to really let in, that when you have dialogues about white supremacy, about racism and racist experiences that happen in your marketplaces and in your communities, when we talk about the problematic history within Oregon, which we are going to spend some time talking about, we're not talking about you and you and you and you and you and you and that guy over there and that one out there and the one who walks through the market yelling whatever thing. We're talking about a system. And sometimes when we're addressing the system, we do have to address individuals. But what we're rigorously working at here is eradicating a system of harm. We're not trying to eradicate people. We're not trying to tell people, hey, you're disposable, you know, because it's actually white supremacy culture that wants us to believe that people are disposable on the way to getting to our goals and our aims. And they're not. We hope that we can get the people to come on the ride with us, right? Like join the anti-racist coaster. We're doing okay over here. But this is a system we're talking about, and it's really, really important to get into that. How's everybody doing? Any questions so far? Cool, cool. If you got them, put them out there. If you don't feel confident putting them in the chat for everyone to see, you can send them directly to Rose Williams, and Rose will find a way to get them into the flow. Rose and I have some solid agreements about just interrupting me when more work needs to happen, so we're all good for that. Alrighty. So let's unpack white supremacy culture a little bit, because there's a lot going on in here. And then I want us to have a little bit of a conversation about where we see these things show up in our market. Whenever possible, I really like to not just put tons of words on slides and read them to you. And also when we're dealing with really intense content, I know that it can be easy to get distracted, right? Like the goal is to stay present. And also it's easy to fall into stories in our head, right? To remember how these things showed up, when they happened. So I'm going to do a little bit of reading of the screen to you, and I apologize for that, but I want you to be able to come back to us and know what's going on and know where we're at. And that's why I have such wordy slides. Usually I have about 5 slides and they're only pictures, and I just talk over them. But I want to get through this list of 15 characteristics of white supremacy culture, and then we'll talk about where we see them in markets. So the first characteristic that we see show up in white supremacy culture, as sort of analyzed and gathered by Tema Okun, and you can read this list at dismantlingracism.org. I know Amanda has also sent it out following Peter's Uprooting White Supremacy workshop, and it's also linked there on the event proceedings page. So lots of ways to get to this, but the first characteristic of white supremacy culture that we see is perfectionism. And in that perfectionist characteristic, what we really see a lot of is that mistakes are seen as really personal, right? And for mistakes to be personal, that means that we are making some relationship between doing wrong and being wrong, right? Like that's at the heart of this thing. There's this focus on wrong. And if we focus on wrong so much, it's really actually hard to focus on what's right. White supremacy culture is not super great at acknowledging when people are doing a good job. White supremacy culture actually doesn't know how to do self-reflection, despite being an incredibly individualistic approach to living, doesn't do a lot of self-reflection, doesn't value that sort of assessing of what's happening. It just says things are right and wrong, and that really matters because of perfectionism. And that striving for perfectionism is the most important thing we could do. And, you know, what I really want to see us doing as an antidote to this, and what's nice about the white supremacy culture piece from Tema Okun is that it's just a list of characteristics and their antidotes. So if you get into that, you'll find a lot more. But the big antidote here is about developing a culture of appreciation. And markets are actually really good at that. Markets are pretty good at saying, look at all of this work, look at this beautiful bounty. But we want to push out more of that. We also want to normalize making mistakes. And while I don't love these memes right now, you can see any day on social media, a ton of memes floating around that say, normalize this, right? Like normalize men crying, normalize all of these things. Well, I want to normalize making mistakes. That's an important culture. And if we can do that, we can start to thwart white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture also thrives on a sense of urgency. And I think we've all experienced that in our jobs, in our communities, in our neighborhoods. Like it's just go, go, go all the time so fast. And when we have so much pressure on urgency, it's really hard to be inclusive. So we see a lot of organizations, right, in the last couple of years saying like, there's our big inclusion initiative, and then no inclusion happens from it. And very often that's because a plan was jammed out with some kind of sense of urgency. So it's difficult to be inclusive. It's difficult to have democratic processes when everything is really, really fast. It is likely that a sense of urgency leads to disposing of potential allies. So very often we might have a conversation with our board about changes we want to make, and we're seeing a particular community that we could have more interaction with at the market, but it might slow some things down, right? We might not be able to check off the box or get the sticker on the chart quite as quickly if we've got to slow down and work with multiple communities. And it's very common to have leadership come in and say, yeah, that's all well and good, but we don't have time for that. So like, let's just dispose of the potential allies and keep the thing on track moving. Sense of urgency also leads to unrealistic work plans. And I think every single one of us has some experience out there where we are living under an unrealistic work plan. And that can be driven by all sorts of complex intersections around that. But that sense of urgency and that get it done really fast often leads to those kinds of things. Let's see, white supremacy culture is really defensive. It's a highly defensive culture. And it demonstrates and manifests that defensiveness in so many ways. In white supremacy culture, we spend a ton of energy trying to make sure that no one's feelings ever get hurt, right? Nobody's feelings should get hurt in white supremacy culture. You might die of white supremacy culture, but we hope your feelings weren't hurt by it. And if we're spending all of our energy making sure that nobody's feelings get hurt, it's really hard to raise new ideas, right? To bring something new and potentially radical or destabilizing into the mix often makes folks really defensive. The other thing that we have happen in white supremacy culture around defensiveness is that the people in power are usually the most defensive. And we have this whole culture that revolves around those people's defensive action and defensive behavior. And if all we do is center that, we've created an oppressive culture. Right? And we've all worked with those people where like everybody's tiptoeing around, trying not to make that person in the top office feel some type of way about their initiative or their power or the way they spoke to people or the way they run a meeting or any of those things. And we can't make real change if all we're doing is really playing to the defensiveness. And you'll hear that I say we a lot in this because I really want to underscore that White supremacy culture is something we all internalize. It's something I internalize as a Black queer femme. It's something that white cis men internalize. It's something that trans and non-binary siblings internalize. We are all getting white supremacy culture in us all the time. And so we're all impacted by it. White supremacy culture is really, really into valuing quantity over quality. And this is something I actually see happen a lot in farmers markets. So our organizational resources go to things we can measure, right? We like goals that we can count and tally and divide and analyze numerically and measure in some ways. And if we value the things we can measure more highly, then that means we don't make time for the things we can't measure. You know what's hard to measure? Community relationships. Those can be really hard to measure. So goals that are around people don't necessarily rate in white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture also has little value for process. And this shows up in lots of places, but it's really hard to measure a process. We can maybe measure how close we are to a goal or how far we have to go, but the process itself is really hard to apply a metric to in that way. And if we can't apply a metric to it, then we really just don't value it super highly. Yeah, I see some folks in chat who are really feeling this about the measurable goals. And a lot of our goals as market managers, board members, however it is you're showing up here today, our goals are more nuanced. They are more soft than that. But when we speak them into the dominant culture, they tend to just kind of get swept away, right? And we're like, oh, okay, we get cowed and humbled in some way and figure I must have been wrong in my attempt to pursue this thing that we couldn't count in that way. And so many of our funding mechanisms want us to count things. So our funders also aren't very invested in seeing us take on goals and processes that we can't count. I think that one of the biggest antidotes to this characteristic of white supremacy culture is about valuing process. And the way that we, at an organizational level, show that we value something is we write it in our value statement, right? We write it in our mission statement. We run our meetings in a way that demonstrates that we really care about those things. So I think a more resilient, less white supremacist organization has agenda flexibility, right? We know when something is pressing at the relationship level, and we need to set those agenda items aside and say, we might have to call a special meeting, or we might have to get through the rest of this by email or Google Docs. But this thing about people has emerged, and we really have to talk about it. So I think that when we get to more flexibility in our organizations and we start to really cement in a value for process, we are thwarting that piece of white supremacy culture. Now, I've already shared with you that I am really, really attached to this one, and it's a worship of the written word, right? Like my entire academic background is about worshiping the written word in particular ways. And this is a place where I'm unpacking and trying to undo my own harms and damage all the time. White supremacy culture says, this one might sound familiar to you, if it's not in the handbook, it doesn't exist, right? So like this thing you want to do or sell or bring or be at the market, I don't have that in my handbook. So I just don't have a way to talk to you about that. I'm sorry, we don't do that at this market. Like I see a lot of that. I find myself wanting to do a lot of it. Well, I wrote these stinking rules for a reason. Why don't you just read them, right? But there's so much more happening in relationship than the written word. And we don't all come from cultures that highly value the written word. Lots of indigenous culture is culture of orality. And in case we've forgotten, because it's easy to forget in white supremacy culture, we are all indigenous to somewhere, which means at some point, all of our people were people of orality. All of our people were storytellers, and some of our people are still storytellers. And that doesn't always show up in this worship of the written word. Our organizations don't value other ways of sharing information, so our applications are very text heavy. Most of us, I don't know of any of us that have an application that's video oriented, where it just says, hey, take 3 minutes and tell me the story of your farm and what you grow. You know, we might see some changes in our vendor populations if we were devaluing the written word in some ways. Along with this idea of valuing the written word is also storage, right? So the written word can be stored, it can be retrieved, it can be organized, it can be categorized, it can be classified. Yo, I was a librarian for a long time. I love categorizing, classifying information, but it doesn't get us all of the way. It's not doing everything we want. And what it is doing that often we don't want is it's privileging people who have strong writing skills. Having strong writing skills doesn't mean you make beautiful produce. It doesn't mean your products are great. It doesn't mean that you sell products to people in a really friendly, community-oriented, plugged-in way. It just means that you wrote a sweet application. And I think we need to be more aware of the ways that we could be opening up our processes to just focus a little bit less on that worship of the written word. Along with this, white supremacy culture is really pretty sure that there's only one right way to do everything. And this one will go along with lots of other pieces of white supremacy culture. But I think one way that you see this show up a lot is that idea of the way we've always done it. And how many of you have gone to a board meeting, a committee meeting, any type of work in process where you show up and you're like, hey, I have this idea. And it's like, yeah, we've talked about that before, but this is the way we've always done it. You know, that is that only one right way approach. The way that we change this is through acceptance, and it's a long drawn out process. This one is not very easy to undo, but it's doable, right? But it's about accepting that there's just so much more than this one right way to do things. And it goes along with devaluing the written word. It goes along with really bringing in some relational, process-oriented, quality-driven metrics. Starts to help move us off of that one right way. Along with the one right way, there's also a lot of paternalism in white supremacy culture. So white supremacy culture is a place that just sort of hands down decisions. I think that Peter referred to this as decisions just appear without any form of transparent process, right? So some parent up there is deciding stuff for us, and this is good for you, and this is how it'll be. And I think a lot of us have had these experiences, right? Because white supremacy culture is shaping and harming all of us. It's not just shaping and harming the folks of color. So your good work and your good ideas are also being lost in the void of paternalism and only one right way. So transparency and really being clear about who has the power to access decision-making in an organization. These are the ways that we start to undo that paternalistic approach to things. White supremacy culture also relies heavily on either-or thinking. It's very limited in its approach to problem solving and to creativity. It's very limited in its approach to curiosity. And so, right, really closely linked to perfectionism, this idea of either-or. It's also really closely linked to that there's one right way. So everything's binary, everything's black and white, everything's left or right, everything is right or wrong. Right? Also tied to that perfectionism. And often the either or thinking really drives the sense of urgency. Like if there can only be two ways to look at a situation, then we better hop to getting on that other one, right? Like if there's only these ways to do things, then let's get urgent. And the way to address this, the way that we thwart either or thinking is with both and thinking. So it gets a little tiresome at times to be the ambassador of both and, but it's really good for your organization. It's good for your market. It's good for your community. It will slow things down, right? If we are considering a variety of ways to get somewhere, then it's a slower process. But it's probably a more inclusive process. It's probably a more democratic process. It is certainly a more anti-racist process. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to start letting in. White supremacy culture is also the place of power hoarding. And I know that we all have examples of places we've seen this in our current organizations and past organizations. It's when we think that power is really limited and there's just not enough of it to go around that we get into this power hoarding belief, right? So I'm the market manager and I have to be the place that the buck stops, and therefore I'm going to throttle the life out of everyone else's ideas. That's a thing that I have found myself doing a number of times because I'm stressed out and there is a real sense of urgency and that market is happening on this date at this time. And so therefore I just start hoarding power because I assume the best of myself. This is true characteristic of folks who are power hoarders. We always assume the best of ourselves, right? Like I was the only one who could do it. I had the only one right way. I'm pretty paternalistic in my approach. There's a sense of urgency driving all of this. And therefore, I'm the good guy. I'm the good guy wielding power this time, right? And when we're power hoarders, we can often see the problems with other people and how they use power, but we're pretty sure that we're the one who's doing it right. So having folks around us who can help us with accountability mechanisms and can help us just say, hey, Shiny, friend, you're getting a little intense about this thing. Maybe we could back away from it for a little while. And I definitely benefit from having those people in my market and in my community who help me realize that, like, I'm just getting really intense about something. And also there's plenty of power to go around. We're actually not running out of power in this country, as it turns out. Related to all of this, and definitely related to defensiveness, is this fear of open conflict. Like, this is a hallmark of white supremacist organizations and their cultures that drive them. People in power in particular are really scared of conflict. We don't want to be told that we're power hoarding and that in this moment, we're not the good person. We're not doing the best that we could be doing. We tend to blame people for raising uncomfortable issues, right? I'm feeling discomfort. It must be the person's fault who brought that up, is what happens a lot with that fear of open conflict. Let's see, the fear of open conflict really, really values being polite and being nice. And we've all seen this play out at awkward family dinners and on social media, right? And very often the people that we're blaming for being not nice or not polite are the people who are experiencing the largest oppression in the moment, right? Who are taking the most trauma shrapnel are the people that we're like, wow, can you be a little nicer about that? And you'll remember at the outset today that I'm asking you to be kind. I'm not necessarily asking you to be nice. It is a kindness to stop your friend or your buddy or your volunteer or whoever when they're power hoarding, when they're fearing open conflict. It is kind to stop and say, hey, do you have room for me to help you see what I'm seeing? That's kind. It may not feel nice to them. It may not feel polite to them, but it was the kind thing to do. So fear of open conflict can actually be thwarted by kindness, by real, true, honest kindness. Let's see. Individualism. Individualism is the thing I think we're most familiar with identifying in white supremacy culture. White supremacy is a highly individualistic culture. Indigenous cultures, all of those other cultures are highly collective. So individualism, right? It speaks to perfectionism. It speaks to the only one right way. It speaks to paternalism. It speaks to so many things. Individualist characteristics don't allow for teamwork. There's just no teamwork here. We don't have room for that. We don't have time for that. Everything's really urgent. We can solve problems alone. And if we're solving all of the problems alone, then we're going to end up feeling really isolated. So isolation is a big part of individualism. Individualistic people are very focused on getting individual credit for things, right? So it's not that the team did everything really great and now we are selling more specialty crops at the market this year. It's that I did something really great. And I want to see systems in place that give recognition to individuals because I see myself as an individual. And if we're really individualistic, then we generally value individualism instead of cooperation, right? And if we value individualism over cooperation or over collaboration, then we become highly competitive. That is a natural extension of that. We become super competitive people. And how we start to unpack this and undo this in our organizations is again at that values place, right? So we start to make it really, really clear that what we value in this organization is teamwork. We valued it so much that we wrote it into the mission. We wrote it into the value statement because we have these statements. I know everybody says, what is a strategic plan for? It's often so we can point at things and say, hey, we don't do that here. And here's how you know, because we wrote it into this statement. We wrote it into this important document. We also need to normalize meetings where we solve problems, right? So starting to change that individualistic nature in the collective spaces that we have and demonstrating that we can problem solve together. It is not, it is not that you are the only one, which is our next characteristic to look at. Lots of people can come together to unpack a thing. I am very, very guilty of being I'm the only one in lots of problem solving initiatives because I'm give it here, I'll fix it. And it's not that I, intellectually believe that other people couldn't do just as great of a job of unkinking this irrigation line or doing whatever, but it's in the moment, I'm feeling really urgent about it. I'm probably feeling a little bit defensive. And I'm just like, give it here, I'll fix the thing. It's fine, I got it. And folks who fall into this I'm the only one trap are also folks who really don't delegate work very well. So we can start to change that by differently valuing the ability to delegate, right? We live in a culture that sort of grades and rates workers and their labor based on how much they could do by themselves. Like, great, so-and-so pulled that whole project all the way down the line, all by themselves. It was terrible and oppressive and exhausting, and they're probably having a nervous breakdown, but hooray, Susie, you pulled the whole thing by yourself. And what we want to do is change that to saying, hooray, Susie brought 5 new team players in to work on this initiative today, and now they are able to get a little bit of rest because they've done such a good job of building a team, right? Like, we want to build that culture into our organizations. And then we want to have evaluation processes that focus on teamwork. So we want to evaluate a person on their ability to engage other people, not on their ability to break themselves doing the work, right? Because that's a problem of white supremacy culture, is that we should just work ourselves to death. That's definitely a piece in there. Kind of along those lines, white supremacy culture says that progress is bigger and more, right? It's like harder, better, faster, stronger is everything about white supremacy culture. So success is when things get bigger and more. The success of your market is that next year you can bring in 15% more vendors. Who knows where you're going to put them, what your COVID safety plan is going to look like, but you'll be succeeding because your market is bigger, right? We've heard that idea. We've heard that numerically driven, measurable metric thing going on. How we combat this is kind of with 7th generation thinking, right? It's that idea of looking at what happens 7 generations out from this decision, from this way of being. How we change that, again, is for bringing in process-oriented goals. So we're not just counting things, but we're really looking at meaningful quality of connection between our initiatives and our communities, between our efforts and the people who are stakeholders of them. It also means that we have to account for costs that are more than money, right? White supremacy culture laden organizations really just focus on the cost as money. And that's where we get into that idea of sacrificing potential allies. Well, people aren't a real cost of the thing. It didn't cost us potential allies. It just cost us $42,000 to do this thing. Or it made us these many dollars. And it doesn't really matter that it made us these new relationships and connections and community. So we want to start to thwart that by really focusing on process and on relationship and on costs that are bigger than numbers and money. Last 2, we're almost there. Objectivity. White supremacy culture loves to pretend that objectivity is a real thing and that we have this sort of neutral, this objective neutral place that we can all get to if we would just be dispassionate, if we would just set aside everything, if we would just stop making people defensive, if we would just stop being wrong all the time, then we could focus on our objective neutrality. Objective neutrality says that emotions are destructive, emotions are bad, emotions are wrong, because they're not rational, right? Like, the objective neutral loves rationality. That's the belief, is that objective neutral leads to linear thinking, it leads to logic, it leads to rationality. That's not true. That's not true at all, right? We know that a healthy culture, a healthy society, a healthy organization, healthy people, healthy reactions and interactions between people involves celebrating different worldviews, celebrating different stories, right? It's about seeing that positionality of a person and finding that there's a lot of merit in there and the way that they understand the world and the way that they come to the world. I think that really the countermeasure to all of this faux objectivity is sitting with discomfort around unfamiliar expression. So it's learning to tolerate poetry if you've never been a person who loves poetry. It's learning to find value in story if you're a person who really just wants a report. It's learning to slow down, right? And do things in different ways. And those are all new and unfamiliar expressions, but learning to really sit with that discomfort, right? I'm not saying eradicate it, make it go away. Discomfort is real. We experience discomfort because we're paying attention. So it's to pay attention to the discomfort and what it's telling us about ourselves and our systems that's going to help us undo that objectivity. And then the last of Tema Okun's characteristics that they've identified for white supremacy culture is the right to comfort. And the right to comfort is woven throughout all of these in so many ways. The right to comfort says that people with power, because this is about people with power, white supremacy culture is about people with power. People with power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort. That's at the heart of this idea. And we scapegoat the people who cause discomfort, right? So we all know that historically, women who have spoken up in business about the wage earning gap have made people uncomfortable and often lost their jobs or lost potential promotions or lost their seat at the table because people were uncomfortable. And white supremacy culture maintains that everybody should be polite, everybody should be nice, and we should minimize discomfort to the extent possible. Often, this piece of white supremacy culture is the piece that finds white folks comparing uncomfortable experiences they've had, maybe unfair experiences they've had with racism. Like we've seen that cringy comment happen on social media and we're like, no, Uncle Larry, don't say that. This is not the same as that guy's experience with racism, right? But that's what this piece of white supremacy culture tells us, is that discomfort is bad. Unfairness is the same thing as, categorical oppression, and that anybody who causes discomfort is the bad guy, right? It's not the source of the discomfort that's the bad thing. It's the person who brought it to our attention that's bad here. And so if discomfort is bad under white supremacy culture, then we know that the antidote is that discomfort is growth, right? And that we have to get to some growth-oriented mindsets. That's what we're trying to do here. And I feel also that really giving some attention to systems thinking is a way that we get through this. So we start to see how things are interconnected and interrelated. We begin to be able to identify these characteristics of white supremacy culture and at least start to name them. It doesn't mean that we always know how to overthrow this deeply ingrained and embedded characteristic of a culture, but it means that we start to appreciate the interconnectedness of the way that we think about things. That's really what this means. So I want to give just a few minutes to talk about ways that we see any of these show up in our market culture, in our market spaces. And you can, I would love it if you wanted to jump on your microphone and share what you see or think about, but you could also just toss it in chat. I've been talking to you all a lot and at you all a lot, and I would love to hear some from you. What's happening in markets? And then we'll move into those things that we can really do to unpack it all. Yeah, absolutely, Polly. Try and do things collectively. That's the heart of the antidote for all of them. Try and do things collectively. And that try is really important, right? It doesn't say do things perfectly, do things quickly. It just says try, right? And trying takes longer, you're absolutely right, but it means that the work is collective work. And then, yeah, rethinking our roles in the groups that we're in is a big part of that, and being able to be flexible. Yeah, you've got it. Tammy has just experienced all of these things on a board and resigned from that board. And I wouldn't be surprised to learn that those experiences are a part of deciding, whoa, this is not the place to give my time right now. And if there's one thing that I could encourage you all to take on board, in addition to, taking anti-racist action, is knowing when to let something go. We cannot change everybody. We can't drag everybody with me. When people are not ready, the learning will not happen. So by all means, please preserve and conserve your precious life force and put it to the service of things that you feel have goingness, things that have legs and can move. Yeah, good call out, love. This is absolutely reorienting towards servant leadership. And for folks who are not familiar with the concept of servant leadership, Google that stuff. There's lots out there about it. And I think that we would all benefit from some thinking and talking together about how we can bring that to our market spaces. And yeah, the idea of leading from behind or within, among, and together. Melissa says letting go. is the hardest thing to do. It's so hard. We could have an entire like 2-hour just support group about trying to let go. It's so real. It's really, really hard. Absolutely. I've shared, some of the ways that I find myself playing these out in the market. And that doesn't mean, right? Like, I don't think I'm the bad person. I'm not a bad person. I'm not inherently deeply flawed, any more so than any other human, because I find myself doing these things, right? Just being able to be present enough to observe them, or being present enough to hear someone else telling me, like, hey, can we talk about this thing I'm seeing happen in these meetings, or in this way, or in the way that you're writing the handbook? Like, being able to be present with that discomfort and with what someone's showing me is the way forward. Yeah, Rachel is saying this emphasis on process is bigger, or progress is bigger and more with markets, for sure. And the chicken egg situation of vendors and customers. More vendors equals more customers. And I agree with you. COVID has in some ways shown us the value of paring down a market. I know that, we've taken a lot of surveys and done our census about the markets with OFMA. And what I find is that I came out of this first year of pandemic market knowing my community a lot better. Having this pared down market means that I had more conversations with people about their families, about their homes, about their home gardens, about all kinds of things that, right, I can't necessarily count in those measurable type of statistics and data counting, but I can feel it. I can feel that when I leave market, my heart is more full. And that's important too. That's not something white supremacy culture wants us to value, but it's definitely a part of the experience. And I see a lot of nodding out there, which tells me that you all are having some similar experiences around that change in market that was mandated because of where we've been with COVID. Yeah. All right, let's jump into the action. I know this is what people want. Like, what am I going to go and do? So let's go do some stuff. Before we can do the stuff, though, we need context. We always need context before we have content. And this is something that the Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington taught me in several workshops when I was an educator on social justice and anti-racist work. And so he says, we are working within organizations where we're trying to do content without a full grasp of the context. In order to create real culture change, there must be a willingness to examine and assess the content. So what that means in real language is we have to talk about this. We have to talk about Oregonian white supremacy. And I know that it's really comfortable to talk at it. Now let's talk about it at a global scale. Let's talk about it at a national scale. But we have to actually talk about it at home. And I'm going to lay out some of the history. And you already know, I know you do because you're here today, that it also lives, Oregonian white supremacy also lives in our markets, it lives in our communities, it lives in our grocery stores, it lives in our schools, it lives in our school to prison pipeline contemporarily. But let me just get us all onto one page about the history of Oregonian white supremacy. So the Oregon Donation Land Act of 1850 is what allowed white male citizens to claim up to 640 acres of free, quote unquote, public land. Y'all know there was no public land, right? There's no public land. This was land that was stolen from Indigenous occupants. So we have to name that thing, right? This is a part of how we get to a place where 5 years later, they got rid of the law after 5 years. But 5 years later, nearly 30,000 white immigrants had entered the Oregon Territory. 7,000 of them had claimed 2.5 million acres of land. And I can tell you from looking that the bulk of those 2.5 million acres of land were west of the Cascades. So in just 5 years, 7,000 people came and took over 2.5 million acres of land that were in Indigenous stewardship. 7 years later, we get the Oregon Constitution adopted in 1857. And the Oregon State Constitution banned Black people from coming to the state, residing in the state, or holding property in the state. We actually wrote this law in 1849, and we sort of assembled a little posse of people, and we said, hey, will you pretend to be our governance until we actually become a state? And they said, sure. And so from 1849 to 1926, we lived that law. We lived it every single day. And I think a lot of folks know that. That's not new information about the history of our state. What you maybe didn't know is that we conveniently left that language on the books until 2002. until 2002, we still said in our Constitution that Black people could not live in the state, could come to the state, and could not own property in the state. And then when folks would ask, like, why does it still say that? Oh, we changed it, it's fine, just ignore that part. But we know that that has a real chilling effect on folks. The last thing to talk about in this sort of historical context here is sundown towns. And sundown towns, I think folks know what those are, but a sundown town was a place where it was illegal for you to be non-white in that area after dark. And I say it was illegal, but I mean it was deadly. You were likely to be driven out with lashes on a good day, and you were likely to be hung or shot on a bad day for being non-white after dark. And I want you to understand this partial, very partial list of sundown towns in Oregon. Ashland, Astoria, Coos Bay, Dallas, Eugene, Florence, Grants Pass, Jacksonville, LeGrand, Lake Oswego, Lebanon, McMinnville, Medford, Milton, Monroe, Oak Ridge, Oregon City, Pendleton, Roseburg, Salem, Springfield, the Dalles, Tillamook. These are all places that we know we had sundown towns. Could have been through the 20s, could have been through the 40s, could have been even past that. This is not a new thing, and this is not a partial thing. Much of the state of Oregon was sundown, because remember that our constitutional history is a place where non-white people couldn't even be, and particularly Black people could not even be. And this is often misunderstood as Oregon having a history that was anti-slavery, because there were no slaves allowed here. However, you need to understand the reason no slaves were allowed was because no Black people were allowed in the state. And that was the easiest way to make that very clear to people. So we have to understand that that's the context of our markets. That's the context of our communities that we're working in, and that folks of color who are in your market community, who are your vendors, they know this. They know this history very well. A lot of these places are still not places I would want to be after dark, to be really honest with you. So, a lot of unpacking of assumptions and definitions around racism, around the system of white supremacy, around white supremacy culture, and now we get to talk about anti-racism. So, anti-racism is taking action against racial hatred, bias, systemic racism, and the oppression of marginalized groups. Anti-racism is a practice. It's a daily way of life. It is literally a thing that from today forward, if you were not already doing it, you wake up every day, you put on your anti-racist hat, and you get moving. So it's a daily way of life. It is the active opposition of white supremacy culture and practices. So those 15 culture characteristics, it's about thwarting those over and over and over again. You cannot be perfect at it. So remember that white supremacy culture wants us to seek perfectionism. It's not real, it doesn't exist. You cannot be perfect at anti-racist action. You just start. There's no certificate. No one will come through. I'm not going to come to your market and tap you on the shoulder and say, I dubbed thee an anti-racist, get going. You just have to start doing it. That's how it works. So what's an anti-racist farmers market and how do we get there? Anti-racist farmers markets have anti-racist leaders. They have anti-racist policies and practices. Anti-racist farmers markets listen to people of color and pay them for their time and labor. So if your next thought is, I'm going to start an advisory group to talk about things, that's great. I love it. You're also going to start writing some grants to figure out how you're going to pay the people that you should be listening to. That's a part of the work. Anti-racist farmers markets are informed about how racism has impacted their communities. So anti-racist farmers market leaders can speak to that Oregon white supremacist culture and all of that history that we just talked about. Likewise, anti-racist farmers markets understand and explain the history of farming with regard to race. It's not enough to just know it and keep it inside. You have to actually be telling people everywhere you go. This is the anti-racist gospel. We understand the history of farming with regard to race, discrimination, and many other forms of harm to people of color. And we can talk about and explain that nationally and locally. You know, I can talk about the history of being a sundown town and how that impacts my market, if that's a place that I'm at. Anti-racist farmers markets hire experts to help them become anti-racist. I do want you to DIY this stuff, but I also need you to understand your own limitations. If we've all internalized a ton of this, and none of us are experts at it, we might need some people who really understand and move with more competence and confidence and confluence through those anti-racist waters and help bring us on the journey. Anti-racist farmers markets value experiential knowledge. We didn't hear anywhere in those 15 characteristics of white supremacy culture any value for people's lived stories, right? For the things that people have gone through and how those are their realities. But an anti-racist farmers market will value that. When your vendor comes to tell you something terrible happened at the market, you will value that knowledge because they know. Anti-racist farmers markets have clear and accessible feedback mechanisms, and the lack of transparent feedback mechanisms is something that Peter spoke about a lot in the last talk on uprooting white supremacy. Anti-racist farmers markets are responsive to the feedback that they get, right? We don't just stick it in a vault. We all know we've had that experience. I went there, I told the manager the thing, nothing ever happened. I'm pretty sure they talked to no one about it. Oh, my friend works there and told me no one ever brought this up. You know, so we have to respond to that feedback meaningfully. And anti-racist farmers markets focus on impact and not intent. I can't say enough times how much intent does not matter. What you thought was going to happen when you said the thing doesn't matter. What matters is what happened when you said the thing, how the person was impacted. What the one vendor said to the other vendor and what they intended to have happen doesn't actually matter. What happens is the one who was harmfully impacted by the oppressive statement. So that's, in a nutshell, what an anti-racist farmers market looks like. So if we want at least 5 things you can go and do, and we'll unpack these. I want you to give the work a home. I want you to design for feedback. I want you to interrupt oppressive behavior. I want you to practice compassionate curiosity, and I want you to audit the culture at your market. So what do I mean when I say these things? Give the work a home means someone has to be responsible. We have all been parts of organizations that have an initiative that lives nowhere. We don't know how we're ever going to get to this, bold and audacious new equity goal because it's not anyone's job to make it happen. All we did was write a statement. So someone has to be responsible. And in saying someone has to be responsible, that doesn't mean it's individualist, doesn't mean that their way is the only right way, doesn't mean all of those white supremacy culture pieces, but it does mean that the work has to live somewhere. And other people have to be able to find out who's responsible. So if you put out your big new audacious equity goal on your website, you better be telling everyone who to talk to at the market about it, who to talk to in an email about it, what committee to show up at if they want to get involved. Other people have to be able to find out what is being done, and you have to take into account that not everybody has all the same access. So you can't just say, well, we made a blog where we keep tabs on all of our diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and then remember that we do actually still have Oregonians who don't regularly access the internet for any reason, right? That's not necessarily accessible. We want to both and our strategies, right? I both have it here, and I have it here, and we have poster boards at the market now. The responsible people need sufficient authority to make change. We've also all been parts of committees where it's like, I want you to take this thing on. I'm actually not going to empower you to do anything differently, except, bump your head against this wall over and over again. So if we're going to make meaningful change and we're going to assign people the responsibility of that change, then we have to allow them to make the changes, right? A committee can work. Because I want to be mindful that most of us are like soloing our way through this underpaid, overworked farmers market management life. So there can be a committee. It can be an advisory group. It can involve community members, but there's got to be an accountability framework in place. And you have to remember that the context is that anti-racist markets pay people of color for their time and their labor. So if you want them to come weigh in on it, there are some things that have to come along with that. And making sure that there's an accountability framework in place so that the leadership of the organization knows what's happening and is ceding that authority to make change. Also, so that laterally, right, members in the committee have the ability to speak up if we are, any one of us, like manifesting those white supremacy culture characteristics. So we have to give the work a home. Orphan work doesn't get done. You have to design for feedback. And I chose the word design on purpose because design is very intentional and design is communicative. And I want to be clear that design is not the same thing as art. I'm terrible at art. I'm terrible at drawing. I am not a good drawer, if that's a word, right? But I can design because design is about communication, and we all communicate every day. The people that your work is intended to serve should have input into the mechanism that you're designing. We need to acknowledge individual experiences and focus on the root causes of those experiences, right? So we're not only privileging individual experience, but we're bringing that together with unpacking the root cause of why did this individual have this experience? We've got to develop clear paths for support or for recourse regarding equity concerns. And that's Peter's language from Aorta, but really knowing that there's a way to go and a way to address equity concerns, a real way, not that black box that no one ever takes anything out of. Again, not the suggestion box that no one checks, but a real clear, meaningful path for support. Feedback has to travel in all of the directions, including lateral, right? So we've got to unpack some of the defensiveness of the people at the top and also get the feedback up to them. They also need to be able to send feedback down, but we don't want a top-down dominant style of feedback. And then we need to have peers who can talk to each other, right? There've got to be sometimes mediations around that. Like, we don't necessarily want every vendor just approaching every vendor. I can see some of you grimacing at the thought. But we do want to have feedback mechanisms that allow for that lateral feedback to happen because it's really important. We have to remember, right, this is speaking to our white supremacy culture characteristics, that relationships, equity work, and coalition building are hard to quantify. So we're not going to get at them with our measuring metrics. We're not going to get at them with our counting culture. We're going to get at them with our relational culture. So we're going to go beyond counting. We're also going to highlight positive feedback. And I think this is the thing market managers, again, do very well, right? We celebrate beautiful products and produce that comes to market. We celebrate great experiences we see between vendors and community. We often celebrate this visually with photos on Instagram and like, look at this person talking to this 5-year-old about a lemon cucumber. It's beautiful and it's great. And we want to do more of that. And we want to see it start to extend into relationality and into anti-racist work. So we're going to highlight the positive stuff that we see there and that we get feedback about. Because often if we do check the suggestion box of doom, we only address the bad things, right? We're like, well, thanks for telling me something good, but whatever. We want to practice interrupting oppressive behavior. And I'm going to introduce you to my favorite statement ever for doing this. We don't do that here. Just say it. We don't do that here. We don't do that here. This is a beautiful phrase. It allows us to avoid debating morality. And have you noticed that Americans love a debate? Right? Any opening they can get. But I haven't told you that you're a bad person for what you did. I haven't told you you can't go do it somewhere else. I've just told you we don't do it here. There's no litigating. Nobody's going to get sued over this, right? And those people who are pernicious and want to find the loopholes and argue about everything aren't really going to get in here. You do need to be clear that this is a conversation ender, not a conversation starter, because interrupting oppressive behavior is about making that thing stop right now. You can come back to that vendor, to that community member, to that board member some other time and start a conversation about anti-racist action, and start a conversation about the problem of what they were doing. But in the moment, what was the most important to know is that we don't do that here, right? So we're cruising through the market and we see somebody standing really close to another shopper. And we walk up and say, hey, can I get you to, give that person 6 feet? And they might say, oh, I wanted to explain to them that I think they're going to get stung by a bee, or I wanted to tuck their tag back in their shirt, which is a weird thing to do in a pandemic with a stranger anyway. Don't touch people, right? But we can just say, okay, I hear your intent, but we don't do that here. We give everyone 6 feet of space unless we're in a family. There is no saying that you're a bad guy. It doesn't say that that instinct you had at the park to tell the person, you're going to get stung by a bee is bad. We're just saying we don't do it here. And so that's the phrase that's going to help you do the most interrupting of oppressive behavior on the fly. So, short activity. Do this in just a couple minutes. I would like you to share a response in chat, or if that doesn't feel good, just go ahead and journal it for yourself. Just pick one or two of these prompts. You don't have to do it all. You could share an example of a time that you spoke up and effectively engaged someone whose comment or behavior was biased and misinformed. You could share how you felt or what it is that you did or said. You could talk about when you're at your best as an ally or a change agent, and you get to define what best means here. You could tell us when and where you get stuck. How do you feel when you're stuck and you just know you're being less effective right now? Oh, you could share what would feel supportive from the OFMA community. So remember, I want you to go out and continue to be kind to one another. And that means to support the learning. So what would feel most supportive from me, from Amanda, from the board, from everyone else? What would help you to continue to grow and develop skills? So pick one of these prompts that's speaking to you in the moment and just tell us a little bit about it or do a little journaling about it. Yeah, Hannah, for sure. And that word try again is so mission critical here. Like, that's all we can do. We can try not to be a perfectionist. And it can become very easy to become a perfectionist about not being a perfectionist. And then to beat ourselves up when you're like, oh, I just caught myself questing for that. So let's also give ourselves compassion. I love leading with compassion and right, lead with yourself. Yeah, good question, Jessica. We're gonna get to that in a minute. But yeah, acknowledging that you're in a really white place and you might be having your first interaction with a vendor from a particular background or culture. And you want to let that person know that you care, that you're an ally, that you want them to have a really good experience. And we also have to not fall into the trap of centering ourselves, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about how do we reach out? How do we make those offers for sure? Thank you for sharing. Yeah, Natasha, I'm my best as an ally when I take the time to learn someone else's positionality. And it does take time, and we're not encouraged to take time in this culture. Nice, Avery. I think that's something we can work on, absolutely. Facebook group, a regular monthly meeting for folks who are doing this anti-racist work. Let's hear from folks about what are we trying, what are we learning, what's working, what's not working, because we're not perfect. Absolutely. Yeah, we can get stuck. We can absolutely get stuck. Lucinda, that's real. Some support from Brittany for the idea of having like a buddy system out there, somebody you can check in with, bounce things off of, people where you feel safe. I want you to feel safe. I also want you to feel brave, right? Because sometimes kindness doesn't come with feelings of safety because that's not the most action oriented. That doesn't have the most goingness, but we want to blend together safe and brave for sure. Rose feels most effective as an agent of change when sharing experiences where we have exhibited white supremacy behaviors and asking others to be vulnerable with them in confronting those traits in ourselves. Yeah. This is the place where we center I stories, right? As much as we hear a lot of talk about, you know, how do we interact? How do we engage? How do we not center ourselves? When we're talking about, hey, I can connect with you on this because I'm also not perfect, that's a beautiful time to be centering yourself and to say, let me tell you about some things that I have done And then hope that that inspires folks to be vulnerable and to share back. Absolutely, yeah. Alrighty, let's keep going. So I've talked about this one a lot. Heather, yeah, getting stuck and moving beyond, encouraging difficult discussions, learning to affect change within the policies and procedures of the organization. About listening, like really listening without that defensiveness. Thanks, Sasha. We get stuck when we know we're going to create a situation that's uncomfortable for people in power. Yeah, I think that's one we could all talk about a lot, for sure. Thanks, everybody. So practicing compassionate curiosity is about learning to ask more questions. Flat out, that's the heart of the thing. It's asking more questions. You know, some people would say it's about asking more and talking less. So we ask the question and then we really have to ease into some listening. And there's lots of ways that we can learn to be a solid listener, and I'll ask you to Google that stuff because we just don't have time today. But let's talk a little bit about asking questions, and I want to see if this gets to some of the questions that we were just talking about around how do we reach out, how do we offer support, and if it doesn't, please let us know and let's get some more dialogue about this going. So one type of way that we can ask questions is to just figure out what type of question asking am I doing, and follow some templates, right? So if we're asking people for more, we want to be really open-ended in the questions we ask. We're trying not to give people a false focus, you know, so we'll just ask them, hey, can you say more about that? And I get a lot of mileage out of, can you say more about that? You know, what is blank like for you? So whatever it is they're telling you about, you know, our latest vendor who comes from a background we haven't had represented much at the market, like if they're telling you about an experience, we don't have to fill in all kinds of stuff in the question. We can just say, what is that like for you at this market? How does this thing show up in your market experiences? When we're asking to give people support, we want to acknowledge, and this is language from Peter at Aorta, but we want to acknowledge that our experiences aren't the same, right? Like we do not have the same experiences. I run this market, you vended this market, you had to apply, and I got to decide whether to let you in or not. So name that thing. Hey, your experience might be different than mine. Can you tell me more about blank and how I can support you? Or you can leave out the tell me more about blank. Just like, can you tell me more about how I can support you? We want to be careful that we're not just reaching out with sort of bland offers to like, hey, do some effort and tell me how to support you. But if it's in a moment of a conversation where this naturally flows, just ask them, how can I support you? We don't know, we can't assume. We can also say, hey, what are your goals? What are some of the challenges that you're facing? Are you open to some thoughts about how we could problem solve together? And that asking about whether or not they're open is really important, because in one way you're asking, hey, do you have the capacity to have this conversation right now? And sometimes the answer is no, not right now. How about next week when I'm not mentally crunching, like fixing some hole in my crop plan, dealing with an irrigation, something else, you know, so not right now. Or because the thing just happened and I'm really activated and I'm going to be defensive and I don't have the room for that right now. Like there's so many reasons. So do you have that capacity for this to happen right now? And sometimes we have to ask for grace, right? Sometimes that is the question, is like, I'm feeling really activated myself. I'm feeling triggered. I'm feeling embarrassed and my face is hot. And I'm sure that I am like flushing out of the collar of my shirt right up my whole face because I'm aware that I didn't do my best, or someone that I'm in community with didn't do their best, or I did my best and it still didn't prevent you from being harmed, right? All of these can be true situations. And so asking for grace can be really hard. It's also really important. And I want to be clear that asking for grace is not centering yourself. It is acknowledging your limitations. So it is acknowledging that you are not perfect. So one way you might ask for grace is to say, some things are coming up for me right now. Would it be okay if I took a few minutes, a day, some time to refocus my mind before I come back to you? Because I want to be present with you, right? And as long as that's genuine and we're able to communicate that the goal here is to be present with you, then this isn't centering me. This isn't about myself. This is about how best I can actually show up for you and be here with you. And also knowing that I'm a person, I'm a human, I have story, and experiences and opinions and biases and all kinds of crap going on inside of me. And sometimes I cannot set all of that aside quickly enough to actually be with you. And it's important to tell someone that, because we've all had that conversation where you're trying to have something really genuine happen with someone and they're kind of sliding off somewhere, or they're looking at their phone a lot, or their face is telling you that they're not really here for this in the same way that their words are saying, right? So just learning to name that thing and own that thing is a huge part of ways that we ask people questions, right? Because sometimes it's just not the time, and that's okay. It does not make you the bad person. It makes you the aware person. We want you to be an aware person because that's a big part of anti-racist action. There are formal ways that we ask questions. And a formal way that I like to ask questions is called the 5 whys. And the 5 whys is exactly what it sounds like. You ask why 5 times, and we'll unpack that for a minute. But use the 5 whys for a lot of reasons. And this powernoodle.com link will give you lots more of that. And these slides will be available to you later. But often we use the 5 whys to get at the root cause of something. So not just the symptoms. Symptoms are sort of easier to name, and we want to go past those and get at why is this way? Sometimes we are looking for evidence. We want to do some data-backed analysis of what's going on in our context. We want to eradicate things, right? So we're trying to thwart all that white supremacy culture for good as best as we can. We're looking for improvements and welcoming change and building a culture that embraces progress. So the 5 whys on the surface sound really great, and they do a lot for us. Sometimes there's some pitfalls. Sometimes they go a little awry in ways that are like this. So in the 5 whys, you usually start with either a problem statement or your proposed solution to a problem. So let's say here, a very likely proposed solution to a problem would be write an equity and inclusion statement. And we would say, okay, why? Why do you want to write an equity and inclusion statement? Well, I want to have a statement that says we're working on doing better. Okay, why? Well, so that I can make it really clear that Black Lives Matter to all of us. Okay, why? Well, I want people to know that not all white people are racist. Okay, why? Because I want to reassure myself that I'm not a racist, right? So sometimes we don't need a whole 5 whys. We can get there more quickly. And sometimes what we discover along the way is like, this is not the best solution, right? Because the root cause of this proposed solution is centering the self. This is an individualistic approach. And we just kind of have to keep digging through it. Often we do them with other people. So as we're talking about formatting, this group to help market managers really work on their anti-racist action, I think one thing we could do with each other is a lot of rounds of 5 whys. Or my board wants me to do this thing, and now I've got to interrogate the whys of that. It can also sometimes happen when we want to reach out to people with support, right? So we had some ideas of questions that might help us get there in terms of, can I offer you some support? But sometimes it goes like this. Oh, well, we just had the Chauvin verdict come down. I know that communities are feeling really activated right now, and it's probably a heavy time, and there's a lot that folks are holding. And I really want to reach out to my BIPOC vendors with a message of support. Okay, why do you want to reach out to these vendors? Well, I want to let them know that I'm thinking of them. Well, why? So they know that I'm here for them. Okay, why? Well, so I can make it clear that I'm a safe person, right? We're only 3 whys in, and we found that we are centering myself in this, because what BIPOC people need most in traumatic times is not about you, right? It's not about you. That's so much of a piece of anti-racist action. And white supremacy culture keeps telling us it's all about me over and over and over again. It's about me. So we want to just keep in mind that all of the questions we're asking sometimes have these, yeah, channel your inner toddler is in there also. And so just bearing in mind that there can be more, and we have to move beyond. And to be clear, it doesn't mean that these proposed solutions are bad, right? So white supremacy culture wants to say, oh no, it's wrong. I did it wrong. And if I did it wrong, then I am wrong. So if this is bad, then I am bad. And we want to thwart that behavior. And instead to say, right now, this proposed solution is not grounded or rooted in anti-racist action and behavior. And we can get there, right? All it means sometimes is that you're going to call up your buddy Anna, who signed on to be your accountability buddy on anti-racism, and say, oh, I just found me centering me. Can you help me resituate and reframe this and find some other reasons that this would be really strong? Or I'm ready to chuck this proposed solution. Let's talk about something that gets at these same ideas, but does it in a way that's not just about me. So it doesn't mean that everything we did is bad and wrong. Another way to ask questions is to use design thinking. And this is another GTS. You can Google that stuff. There's lots out there about design thinking, but the basic design thinking process says we start with empathy. And empathizing in this case means seeking understanding. And that once we've got better understanding, we can really define the problem that we're trying to address. And then we ideate. And ideate is just brainstorming. And everybody can ideate. We are all uniquely capable of terrible and great ideas, all at one time. And once you have some ideas, you figure out some mock-ups, right? Whether that's a draft statement on your equity and inclusion stuff, whether that's a draft of a project or a pilot program, and then you test it. And these three of brainstorming, prototyping, and testing, they're in a little spiral, and they just go around over and over and over again. And so you can use some design thinking. And sometimes that's a nice way to get at that intersection between story and sort of measurement, and say that there is a way to honor both of these needs and move forward. The last thing I want you to think about, and this really builds on the previous four, is doing a culture audit, right? And this is big work. This is big, big work, and you cannot do it by yourself. So this is a place where you're drawing on how to work with a committee and do less harmful committee action. You know, so we know that people need authority to make change, all of those things about giving the work a home. But a culture audit is where you are looking mostly at power, transparency, and unstated norms. Or put another way, in terms of characteristics, you're looking for power hoarding, you're looking for fear of open conflict, and you're looking for perfectionism. You want to question everything, and you have a bunch of question asking mechanisms to do that. You want to recognize intersectionality, right? So many things can be racialized, things can also be gendered, things can also be shaped by class. And we know that when we're looking at intersectionality in this country, we've got to put race at the center of the thing, right? So race has to be in the center of the analysis, not because it's the most important form of discrimination, but because it's the longest running problem we've got in this country. We're going to challenge the dominant perspective, and we can better understand the dominant perspective because it's shaped by those characteristics of white supremacy culture. We want to value our experiential knowledge, right? So in a nutshell, we're looking at what are your policies, the formal things of your market say that you value. What are the practices, the stuff you actually do, the informal practices of your market say that you value? What does your value statement say that you value? If you don't have a value statement, get one. We've talked about all the ways that we can thwart white supremacy culture with our value statements and with our official documents. They do still matter, even though they're written. But look at what your value statement says, or what it would say if you had one, and analyze that gap. What's the delta between what we say we do, what we actually do, and what we claim to value? And then get in there and address that gap. Like, that's the way that we actually do anti-racist action. It's endless analysis, it's storytelling, and it's transparency, right? So when you do this work, be transparent with your communities that you're doing it. Tell them that you're doing it. Invite them into the process to help you find all of the characteristics that are hanging out in your organization, in your market. Help them, or allow them to help you see those artifacts of white supremacy culture and of racist experience in your market. And remember that these things are systems and they're experiences. And just because you will surface white supremacy culture in your market, and there's because you will find that your market is positioned within white supremacy as a system, it doesn't mean that your market's full of white supremacists. That's not what we're talking about. Your market might have some white supremacists in it. I don't know. That's not at the heart of the analysis. The analysis is about the culture. The analysis is about the things we've internalized. The analysis is about all of those unwritten, unspoken norms that are just the way, right? So if we actually privilege vendors who show up 20 minutes before load-in really starts, and, you know, are very quiet and keep things in a certain way, then we're saying that we value the ability to control people, that we value a certain type of complicity with culture, and that we therefore likely, without noticing, are biased against people who are always late, who don't necessarily read the handbook, who understand things in other ways, who keep us 20 minutes after with their story about the kid with the cucumber, right? All of those things get mixed up in there. And so we want to try to tease those things out and make it really explicit. What is it that we value? Why do we value that? And where are we telling people that that's what we value? The word audit, right? It's an intentional word. It carries gravity and weight. Nobody wants to get audited ever. It sounds like a bad thing. And I don't want you to think like, oh, this is this terrible task I have to do that nobody ever wants to have. But I do want you to be thinking this is serious work, right? This is something that takes weight and time. There can't be a sense of urgency attached to this. And we've got to be really curious. We've got to be curious and compassionate with ourselves and with others about getting in there. I have some thought dust for you. These didn't necessarily fit in specific places, but these are things I believe strongly in and that I believe strongly help us get where we're going. So dump out, support in. And this comes from the circle theory, and you can Google that, circle or ring theory, and it originates from how we support people with cancer. But the ideas really hold up. Very often, when some terrible, traumatic, racist thing happens, the people we tell about it the most are the people who already experienced it, right? So that Black vendor, that new Middle Eastern vendor, that Latinx non-binary vendor who experienced the thing, we tend to want to hang around and try to commiserate with them, right? Like, oh man, this world, oh, white supremacy culture everywhere. Ah, that person's exhausted. They're fatigued. Something traumatic just happened to them, and they don't want to hold your complaints about the world, most likely. They'll do it for a lot of reasons, mostly involving fight or flight or fawn. But we want to dump out. So like, how can I take this off of this person? How can I bail some of that out for them? And then how can I call my buddy in my OFMA support network and be like, whoa, this thing really happened. You have 10 minutes to just listen to me dump about how this thing happened at the market today and how I'm feeling about it, right? And that consent seeking piece is really important because we don't know what happened in our buddy's day. So we need to check in about that. Don't confuse being with doing. We are not the things that we do, right? They're not the same. So keep those separate for a reason, because white supremacy culture wants you to believe that you are every mistake that you have ever made or will ever make. You're also not that one good thing you did that one Tuesday in May, right? Have the meeting during the meeting. I cannot stress this enough. Have the meeting during the meeting. Don't have the actual anti-racist content of the meeting happen in the hallway after the meeting with the three people who are like, oh yeah, I wish I'd said something. If you wish you would say something, say it. Be vulnerable, interrupt oppressive behavior. Don't have the meeting after the meeting because it shortcuts everyone. Also, for people who experience microaggressions and oppression in meetings, it makes me feel even worse when you come up afterwards and tell me, wow, that was really racist. I can't believe they said that to you. Cool, where were you then? You know, this happened to me on a bus where an older white man actually made me give up my seat on a half-empty bus. And he just insisted that that had to be his seat. And I was like, well, I'm not going to have this fight with this old guy today. So here I go. And I just moved along to the back of the bus, which is clearly where he wanted me to go. And afterwards, when I got to my stop, 5 people got off the bus. I don't even think it was their stop, got off the bus and were like, oh my God, that was so racist. I'm so horrified that that happened to you. Where were you then? And I don't think I said very nice things to those people. In the long run, it might have been kind to tell them how they were complicit in that racist thing that just happened to me, but it wasn't nice. I was feeling compressed and really bummed and couldn't believe that you all had the time to interrupt your commute, to get off the bus, to tell me this thing, and then go right back to the stop to wait 20 minutes for the next one. But you didn't have the space and the time to interrupt it when it was happening to me, right? So have the meeting during the meeting, say the things that need to be said at the time that you can, if you can. Right? There are always things we reflect on later, and then we have to reach out and say, hey, do you have capacity for me to, I just had a realization about what happened. And then don't conflate the thing that you did or didn't do with who you are. You are not a terrible racist white supremacist because you didn't interrupt the thing. If you didn't see it, you didn't see it until later, right? Along those lines, avoid tokenizing people. I do want you to bring in people of color. I do want you to pay them for their time and labor, and I want it to be meaningful. It's not just a box you check. And we've all seen that. We see it on TV shows. We're like, why is the Middle Eastern character in this show? We've never seen anything about their culture. They're just kind of ambiguously brown, and I'm not sure what they're doing here. That's tokenizing. We don't want to do that. We also don't want white saviorism. You are not going to make or break this person's life. However, that thing you could do can make their life easier, and that's important, right? But you're not the savior. I'm also not the savior. And then the last thing I want to encourage you to do, because I think it will make radical changes in your life, is to let go of the word but. Nothing good came out of the word but. We all know that when we say but, we're eradicating all the things we said before. Oh, that was a really good point you brought up in the meeting, but I feel like you could have been nicer about it. Well, you actually didn't think it was a good point I brought up then, or you would not have said that thing right then. However, the word and is relational. The word and is expansive, right? I thought that was a really great point you brought up in the meeting. And I could see that some of how it was delivered really lost some people. That's a really, really different statement. This is something that a person named Becca Love taught me when I was teaching at PCC. And it has stuck with me for like 5 years now. And I have to tell you that my life is demonstrably better for having let go of the word but. And sure, we still say it all the time. It's like an gap filling word. But really look for the places where and is actually what you meant. And I think you'll find that you start to have differently meaningful dialogues with people. So my cheapy little fitness band is buzzing me to say that I've been sitting still for too long, which means we're about at the end of this here workshop. I want to say that I'm still around to unpack things with you. I can hang out for a little bit after we turn off the recording if that works for you. You can also get in touch with me. So come through pdx@gmail.com is the market email address. That is the place to make sure that I will actually check your email. DMing me on Instagram is a great way to ensure that sometime in November, I might notice it and get back to you, because farmer. I want to thank you all for holding your discomfort, for sitting with it, for being present with it, because it's real and it's a big part of what we do. And I do want to point you to resources that are going to support your anti-racist market journey as much as possible. We know that the Farmers Market Coalition Anti-Racist Toolkit will be coming out. I don't have a date for you on that. I want to say it's like fall and beyond, because lots of the people in that work group are also farmers and market managers who have lots happening in this season, but that will be coming. I think that everything I've spoken about today fits in with that, but it's not a replacement for that. It's not a substitution. It's not like I went to that talk, so I already know what's in the toolkit. The toolkit will build on all of this and take you further on your anti-racist journey. And that's what I got for you all. Wow, look at that, 2 on the dot. Totally. Best of luck with all of those other meetings out in the world. I know that carving out 2 hours to talk about anti-racism when everybody's markets are either going now or are starting in like 2 weeks was a lot of time. So I thank you for this dedication. It means a lot to me as a fellow market manager with you. It also means a lot to me as a Black woman in Oregon. So thank you for this time. I hope that you will hydrate really well, because stress and anxiety takes a lot out of us. I hope that you will get rest. You can absolutely share this with other groups, orgs, and vendors. The recording will come out and hit the event proceedings page. I'm also happy to share the editable copy of the slides in case someone's like, I'm going to take this on and do it myself. I believe very much in open access to information. So if there's something I can do in that way to help you have the conversations, please let me know. I wondered if everyone saw that. Yeah. I did have to build that in for myself. Go in the sun after you give this talk that you've been working on for weeks and weeks. Thanks, everybody.